May 10th, 2026, Mount Makalu, Nepal. Shelley Johannesen had just stood on the summit of the fifth highest mountain on Earth, and the only thing standing between her and home was a single red mitten sitting on a boulder in the snow. Not on Everest, not on Aconcagua, not on any of the dozens of high-altitude peaks she had already climbed. Nothing had ever stopped Shelley Johannesen from coming back down. She was an adventure racer turned high-altitude mountaineer, a mother of three from Oregon who had rebuilt her entire life around the mountains. She had even turned back above the south col of Everest the previous spring, not because she couldn't go higher, but because she understood that getting down mattered more than standing on top. That is the mark of a serious mountaineer. But she never came home. The part that bothers me about this story is that you will not find one reckless decision in the timeline. You will not find one obvious mistake. What you will find is a chain of weather, and injury, and altitude, and vanishing rescue windows, where every layer of protection failed at once. This is the terrifying last minutes of Shelley Johannesen. Welcome to Tourist Tragedies. To understand why this death shook the climbing world, you need to understand what kind of mountaineer Shelley Johannesen actually was. She was not a celebrity climber with a film crew and a sponsor budget. She was not someone chasing viral summit photos. She was someone who had arrived at the mountains later in life, fallen completely in love with them, and then spent years building a climbing resume that most people never come close to matching. Her expeditions with partner David Ashley included Everest, Aconcagua, and a full roster of Himalayan peaks. Aconcagua alone rises to more than 22,000 feet. That is roughly equivalent to stacking 4 Empire State Buildings on top of each other and then climbing the entire thing in thin, freezing air with no elevator and no second chances. And honestly, when you look at what she had already done at altitude, you start to understand why Makalu looked like the right next step. Not easy. Possible. The previous spring, she had climbed high on Everest and made the decision to turn back above the South Col. In serious mountaineering, that is not failure. That is judgment. That is the decision that keeps people alive long enough to try again. She tried again. She tried Makalu. And on May 9th, 2026, she stood on the summit of the fifth highest mountain on Earth. That should have been the whole story. How does someone become this? In Shelley's case, the answer does not involve a childhood built around ice axes or some prodigy myth. It involves an ordinary life that eventually reached a turning point. She was an Oregon native, a mother of 3, someone who had built a full life before the mountains came into it. She came from an adventure racing background, the kind of endurance sport that demands mental hardness and physical discipline, the kind of preparation that translates well to high altitude. But it was the mountains specifically that reshaped the second half of her life. She met David Ashley, and together they discovered that the standard 5-day work week and the standard life plan were not what either of them wanted anymore. Outside Magazine reported that Ashley described a shared realization, that there was a different way to live. They built Dash Adventures around that realization, a small expedition company whose motto was as simple as it was sincere. Climbing mountains and making friends. That may sound soft next to Makalu's technical demands, but it says something real about who Shelley was on an expedition. At altitude, where you spend days waiting out weather in a tent and every small act takes twice the effort it should, personality matters. Patience matters. The person beside you matters. Shelley Johannesen was the kind of person people wanted beside them on a mountain. She was accomplished, serious, and deeply committed to the idea that the mountains were meant to be shared. By the time Shelley and Dave went to Makalu in the spring of 2026, they had built something real. Dash Adventures offered trekking and climbing trips guided by the two of them, and their expeditions took ordinary people into extraordinary terrain across multiple continents. Their life was built entirely around what they loved most. She had summited Everest with Dave. She had climbed across South America. She had stood on summits in the Himalayas that most people will never see in photographs, let alone in person. And she was doing all of it not as a solitary pursuit, but as a shared one. With a partner, with clients, with a small community of people who came back to Dash Adventures because of how Shelley and Dave made them feel on the mountain. On May 5th, while waiting at Makalu Base Camp for the weather window to open, Shelley wrote publicly that the hardest part of the expedition had been the waiting, emotionally and physically. She wrote that the winds had subsided, that the team was healthy, that they were ready to go. That line is painful now, reading it back. The winds had subsided because wind would become one of the central facts of what happened 4 days later. She also wrote that she was grateful to be in Nepal, that Makalu would be a different challenge than Everest, and that she was looking forward to experiencing what she had to offer the mountain. That phrase has stayed with me since I first read it. What she had to offer the mountain, not what the mountain had to offer her. There is a kind of maturity in that framing that tells you everything about where she was in her climbing life. She was not chasing the mountain for glory. She was giving it everything she had, as she had given everything to every summit before. And on May 9th, at 10:30 in the morning, she and Dave and their 2 Sherpa guides, Tawa Sherpa and Phurba Sonam Sherpa, stood together on the summit of Makalu at 8,485 meters above sea level. Life was, in the word Ashley later used to Outside Magazine, amazing. May 10th, 2026. The team had spent the night at Camp 3 at roughly 24,600 feet after their summit push the day before. This is standard practice on an 8,000er. You do not descend immediately after summiting because the body is too depleted to do it safely. You rest at altitude, you recover what you can, and then in the morning, you begin the long way down. The descent from Makalu is not a gentle walk. The mountain is remote, steep, and pyramid-shaped, located southeast of Everest in one of the most technically demanding corners of the Himalayas. CBS, citing AFP, described it as exceptionally challenging because of its remoteness and its extreme weather. That morning, as the team began descending from Makalu La toward Camp 2, the conditions were not clear. The night before had deposited more than 30 inches of fresh snow on the mountain. Winds had reached 60 miles per hour. The slope below them had been sitting under that weather for hours. Tawa Sherpa was leading the descent. Shelley was directly behind him. David Ashley and Phurba Sonam Sherpa were farther back on the rope, and somewhere between Camp 2 and Camp 3, at roughly 23,600 feet, the route changed. One detail would stay with Ashley afterward, and it is the kind of detail that tells you exactly how fast everything happened. A rope hanging loose, a red mitten on a boulder, and beyond it, snow and rock already moving down the face. To understand what happens next, you need to understand what a wind slab actually is. A wind slab forms when wind picks up loose snow from one part of a mountain and deposits it in thicker, denser layers somewhere else, usually near ridges and on leeward slopes, where the wind drops its load into sheltered pockets. The American Avalanche Association describes wind slabs as cohesive layers of wind-drifted snow. Avalanche Canada explains that these slabs often form just out of sight, in terrain, where you would not necessarily look before stepping. Think of it this way. Fresh snow by itself is not always the danger. Wind is the machine that makes it dangerous. It takes snow from an exposed face, carries it, and stacks it somewhere sheltered, pressing it into a hard, dense plate. Beneath that plate, there may be weaker, older snow that cannot support the weight sitting on top of it. For days or even weeks, everything looks still. The surface looks like any other slope. And then one hairline crack can travel across the entire plate in under a second, and when it does, the mountain does not wait. Outside reported that the night before the descent, more than 30 inches of snow had fallen on Makalu, followed by winds reaching 60 miles per hour. Rescue coordinator Funuru Sherpa told Outside that the avalanche was nearly impossible to predict, an anomaly produced by the unusual volume of snow and the extreme winds that season. That is the trap. From base camp, from a photograph, from any distance at all, that slope would have looked ordinary. Wind had been turning it into a loaded shelf for hours. David Ashley saw the crack form to his left. He had 1 second, and he used it to yell one word, slab, and then the slope released. The avalanche hit all 4 climbers simultaneously. Ashley and Phurba Sonam Sherpa were carried only a short distance and were able to arrest their fall. But Shelley and Tawa Sherpa were hit directly and at full force. The slide severed the fixed line that secured them to the mountain, and it carried them between 1,000 and 1,300 vertical feet down the face. a vertical distance equivalent to falling the height of a skyscraper, not through open air, but through compacted snow, over exposed rock and across ice, at nearly 24,000 feet above sea level. When the slide finally stopped, Shelley and Tawa were not buried. That was the first and only thing that went right. But both were badly injured, and they had come to rest on a dangerous ledge close to a cliff. Ashley and Phurba Sonam Sherpa searched for them through terrain stripped of its fixed lines, every step slow and technical. When they finally reached Shelley and Tawa, both were alive. But they could not be moved without outside help. They were too high for a straightforward helicopter rescue. The sun was going down, the wind was building again, and the supplemental oxygen the team had carried for the ascent was nearly gone. At roughly 24,000 feet, options narrowed to almost nothing. Ashley and Phurba Sonam Sherpa were exhausted and without supplemental oxygen, having used their supply during the ascent and the search. The original plan, a quick descent from Camp 3 to Camp 2, no longer existed. A rescue team left Camp 2 with oxygen, water, and food, but winds intensified to 70 miles per hour, and the team was forced to turn back within 2 hours. Phurba Sonam Sherpa then descended alone through the dark and the wind toward Camp 2, reaching it at around 9:40 in the evening, and warning rescuers that Tawa and Dave could also die without oxygen and warm fluids. Ashley stayed with Shelley on the ledge. He wrapped them both in a sleeping bag and held her as her condition continued to worsen through the night. Rescuers finally reached them at roughly 2:45 in the morning and began administering oxygen and emergency care. It was not enough. Shelley Johannesen died in the early hours of May 11th, 2026, on the side of Mount Makalu in David Ashley's arms. She was 53 years old. Her body was brought down by 6 Sherpa climbers to Camp 2, airlifted by helicopter to Kathmandu, and returned to her family. Tawa Sherpa and David Ashley were also airlifted to Kathmandu for treatment, and officials reported their conditions as stable. When you lay the facts in sequence, a terrifying picture begins to form. Not a picture of recklessness and not a picture of ignorance. A picture of margins disappearing one by one until there were none left. The team had successfully summited Makalu and was descending from extreme altitude, a point at which the human body is already significantly depleted after days of effort and oxygen deprivation. The mountain had been struck the night before by more than 30 inches of snow and winds reaching 60 miles per hour, conditions described afterward as anomalous even for Makalu. That weather almost certainly created wind-loaded slabs on the slopes above the descent route, forming the kind of cohesive, unstable shelf that looks identical to safe terrain until the moment it does not. When the slab released, it severed the fixed line securing 2 of the 4 climbers, transforming a dangerous descent into a high-altitude rescue with no straightforward solution. The rescue window closed quickly. The first team turned back in 70-mile-per-hour winds, leaving injured climbers at 24,000 feet in darkness, cold, and without supplemental oxygen. This is the Swiss cheese model applied to the mountains. A catastrophe happens when multiple independent layers of protection each contain a hole, and for one brief moment, those holes align perfectly. Weather forecast, snowpack stability, altitude, fixed rope, injury severity, rescue conditions, nightfall. Any single one of those factors might have been survivable in isolation. Together, they formed a trap with no exit. Rescue coordinator Funuru Sherpa told outside that the teams had followed proper safety protocols and that the avalanche had been nearly impossible to predict. That is what makes this story so difficult to sit with. The lesson is not that someone ignored the mountain. The lesson is that the mountain changed faster than any human response could match. In one of her last public posts from Makalu Base Camp, Shelley Johannesen wrote that she was grateful to be in Nepal and that the climb ahead would be a chance to experience what she had to offer the mountain. She offered everything she had. Shelley Johannesen died because a rare alignment of altitude, heavy snowfall, wind-loaded terrain, severed rope, injury, and a closed rescue window removed every margin at once on one of the most remote mountains on Earth. Not because of one mistake, but because every small, invisible failure lined up perfectly for a tragedy she could not have predicted.